So if you accept those 7 propositions, and as I say, happy to debate any of them, now we can start to debate. Now we can start to ask the question, do the cooking, to chop this issue up and say, okay, what does this really mean for Australia? It's worth making the point that this is not a theoretical discussion. We're not asking ourselves what future for Asia would, in the minds of international relations theorists, be the best imaginable. That's an interesting theoretical question. That's not what I'm interested in. Nor is it an intelligence assessment. That is, what future for Asia do I think is most likely, a prediction of what the most likely outcome. That's interesting, but that's not what we're interested in. The question for us is the quintessential policy question. What's the best reasonably achievable outcome? What's the best we can do for the country? And that's the question I want to focus on. Now, actually, there are 2 sets of policy questions that I address in a quarterly essay. One is, how should we in Australia want Asia to evolve to accommodate China's growing power? And the second is, how should we evolve to maximise our capacity to work effectively in that region, and particularly to work effectively in that region if we don't get our most favoured outcomes. I'm going to focus just on the first of those today, but happy to talk about the second if people wish to. So I'm going to ask, how do we want Asia's order to evolve? Now, this is sort of a standard policy methodology when you confront an issue like this, and it starts with making sure we understand the problem. So let me just make sure we understand what the problem is. The Asian order, which has kept Asia peaceful for 40 years and which has enabled Australia to develop this phenomenal economic relationship with Northeast Asia, has enabled those economies to grow, has enabled us to remain a close ally of the United States, has in short enabled Australia to do everything it's done that really matters to us in the international space, has been based on uncontested US primacy. It's not just that America has been the strongest power in Asia, it's that its position in Asia has not been contested by other Asian major powers, and particularly by Japan and China. The history of America in Asia for the better part of the 20th century was the history of America trying to manage challenges to its position in Asia by Japan and China, and around about 1972 that stopped. Second proposition is that China, as it grows, will not continue to accept US primacy. In other words, the era of uncontested US primacy is over. And the third proposition is that we will therefore have a new order in Asia. And the question is, what should it look like? So if that's the problem, the second thing to ask is, what are the stakes? How much does this matter to us? Because it's always a big mistake to get fussed around a policy question and in the end doesn't matter much. In the quarterly essay, I give a stark account of this, and I want to give you a stark account now. We can't assume that the emergence of a new order in Asia will not be effectively managed. It might well be effectively managed. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we might be able to talk about the new Asian order with as much confidence as we have been able to look back at the Asian order which has kept Asia so peaceful for the last 40 years. And the good news is that both sides certainly want it managed. No one in Beijing, no one in Washington, no one anywhere in Asia, possible exception of the crazies in Pyongyang, actually want to see an unstable Asia. But both sides, I'll reduce it somewhat artificially, but I think credibly to a bipolar thing between the US and China, both sides want it to be managed, but both sides want it to be managed on their terms. And the risk of escalation is high. Of course, once competition begins, there's no inevitability as to how far it's going to go. But competition, particularly strategic competition between very strong states with a very strong sense of their own selves, of their place in the world, of their relationship with the other, such strategic competition does tend to be very hard to control. Because once you start competing, it's very hard to step back. It's very hard to read, not to avoid reading what the other guy does as being directed at you and vice versa. So I think we should be very conscious when we address the problem of how Asia should evolve, that the risk of it evolving into a highly contested strategic environment between the US and China, notwithstanding all the immense incentives that both have to avoid that, is quite high. And I don't have to argue that it's 99%. I don't even have to argue that it's 50%. There's a 20% chance that the new order in Asia could be intensely competitive between the US and China. That would be a very serious risk.